I couldn't move, not my arms, not my legs, not even my fingers. I lay there in the small guest bedroom of my childhood home in Asheville, North Carolina, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, while my body felt like it had been poured full of wet cement. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked steady and unconcerned. I remember thinking with a strange calm that this was what people meant when they said they were too tired to move. Then I heard my sister's voice. Whitney stood just outside my door. I couldn't see her face, but I recognized the soft, careful tone she used when she wanted something to sound reasonable, controlled, harmless. "Just make it look natural," she whispered. There was a pause. Another voice answered her. A man's voice, low, professional, not someone I knew. My door creaked open. Light from the hallway spilled across the floor, stopping just short of my bed. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. Whoever he was, he didn't hesitate. He moved like someone who'd been in strangers' bedrooms before, like this wasn't new to him. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. The man stood beside my bed. I felt the mattress dip as he sat down. 2 fingers pressed lightly against my neck just under my jaw. He was checking my pulse, not hurried, not panicked, as if this were a routine part of his job. "She's awake," he said quietly. "No, she's not," Whitney replied. "She just can't move." There was a brief silence. I could hear my own breathing shallow and uneven and the faint hum of the air conditioner kicking on. "This isn't what you told me," the man said. His voice had changed, less confident now. "I told you she was ill," Whitney said. "She is. We don't need her talking. We just need this documented." Documented. The word landed harder than any threat could have. The man shifted. I felt him glance down at me again, his fingers hovering as if he expected me to twitch or blink or do anything to prove I was still a person in the room. I didn't. I couldn't. I can't sign off on anything like this. He said after a moment, "Not if she doesn't need to sign." Whitney cut in. "That's the whole point." My sister stepped into the room then. I could see her shoes near the foot of my bed. Sensible flats. The kind she wore when she wanted to look responsible. "We just need her condition verified," she continued. "Temporary until things are sorted out." The man exhaled slowly. "And you're sure this is what your mother would have wanted?" Whitney didn't answer right away. Outside, a car passed on the street, tires hissing on pavement. Life going on as usual. "Yes," she finally said. "I'm sure." The man stood. The mattress lifted beneath me. Papers rustled. I caught the faint smell of aftershave and leather as he moved away from the bed. "I'll step out," he said. "You should give her time." They left together. The door closed with a soft click. I lay there in the quiet, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, my mind racing ahead, while my body remained trapped. I didn't know who that man was. I didn't know what Whitney wanted to document. But I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was happening to me wasn't an accident, and my sister had opened the door on purpose. I lay awake the rest of that night, staring into the dark, listening to the house breathe around me. By morning, my body obeyed me again, but something else had gone rigid inside. A line had been crossed. I didn't yet know how or how far, but I knew this hadn't started with the tea or the man in my doorway. It had started long before I got sick. Whitney was already up when I made it to the kitchen. She stood at the counter with her hair pulled back, a legal pad open beside her coffee mug. She glanced at me quick and assessing, then looked away. "You feeling better?" she asked, her tone light, almost dutiful. "A little," I said. It wasn't a lie. My limbs worked. My voice sounded like mine again, but the room felt tilted, like the floor beneath us wasn't level anymore. She nodded, satisfied. "Good, we've got a lot to handle today." That sentence had always belonged to her. Growing up, Whitney was the one everyone worried about. She stayed close to home. She worked beside Mom in the bakery after school, learned the ovens, the suppliers, the regular customers by name. When Dad died, she was still living there. When Mom's knees gave out, Whitney was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who left. I went to college. I took a job in Raleigh. I built a quiet, stable life that didn't require anyone else to hold it together for me. In our family, that made me the practical one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. Whitney liked to remind me of that. "You always land on your feet," she'd say, usually with a smile. "You don't need this place the way I do." The bakery was never described as ours. It was Mom's and by extension, Whitney's. I helped when I visited. I covered shifts after Mom passed, handled invoices when Whitney was overwhelmed. But decisions happened without me. Accounts were already set up. Vendors already negotiated with. I told myself it made sense. Whitney had been there. She knew the business. I was just back temporarily doing what I could until things settled. That morning, she slid a stack of papers across the counter without looking at me. Schedules, vendor lists, numbers written in her tight, slanted handwriting. "I'll need you to take over the front today," she said. "I've got meetings." "With who?" I asked. She paused just long enough for me to notice. "People who've been helping us." Us. The word sounded generous. It didn't feel that way. I thought about the man from the night before. The way he'd touched my neck, checking my pulse, like I was an object to be evaluated. I thought about the word documented. But I said nothing. That had been my role for years. Letting things slide because pushing back always made me feel like I was accusing her of something she hadn't said out loud. Like I was being ungrateful for the space she allowed me in a life she considered hers. Later that afternoon, I stood alone behind the bakery counter, serving customers who offered condolences I'd already heard 100 times. They spoke to me kindly, but they asked for Whitney by name. They always did. "She's the strong one," an older woman said as she took her change. "Your mother leaned on her so much." I smiled and nodded the way I always had. By the time the shop closed, I understood something I hadn't let myself see before. Coming back hadn't put me back into the family. It had put me in the way. The house felt different once I started moving through it on my own again. Not hostile, not yet. Just watchful. As if every familiar surface had learned how to keep a secret. It was Wednesday, and the rain that had been threatening all morning finally started after lunch, tapping steadily against the windows. Whitney had already left for one of her meetings. She didn't say where, only that she'd be back late. I didn't ask. I went back to the guest room to lie down, telling myself I was still recovering. That much was true. My muscles ached in a dull, unpleasant way, and my head felt thick like I'd slept too long and not well. As I shifted the blanket, something slid off the edge of the bed and hit the floor. I froze. It was just a piece of cardstock. White, clean, too clean for a house that hadn't been dusted properly since before Mom got sick. I picked it up slowly. Caleb Rourke, Mobile Document Witness and Notary Services, Asheville, North Carolina. A phone number, an email address, nothing else. I sat there for a long moment, the card resting in my palm, feeling something inside me tighten. The man from the night before hadn't come empty-handed. He hadn't wandered in by mistake. He'd brought credentials. Down the hall, I heard voices. Whitney was home earlier than she'd said she would be. She wasn't alone. I didn't mean to listen, I really didn't. But the house carried sound the way it always had, and their voices traveled easily through the thin walls. "You told me this would be straightforward," a man said. His voice was unfamiliar but sharper than the notary's, more impatient. "It is," Whitney replied. "She just needs time. The doctor said she's exhausted." "That's not what I'm talking about," he said. "We're up against the deadline." There was a pause. Papers shuffled. She can't handle the stress right now, Whitney continued. And honestly, she's never been good with this kind of thing. I recognized the other voice then, Grant Hale, Whitney's fiancé. He'd been around more since the funeral, always polite, always distant with me. I'd assumed that was grief, or nerves. What matters, Grant said, lowering his voice, is that she can't interfere. If this goes through cleanly, we're done worrying. Just give me a few days, Whitney said. She trusts me. The word landed wrong. I stood and stepped closer to the door, careful to keep my breathing even. We can't wait much longer, Grant said. If she signs something later, fine. If she doesn't, there are other ways. Whitney didn't answer right away. The point, Grant added, is that we need it documented. Properly, no room for challenges. Documented. Again. I backed away from the door before they could notice anything. My heart was beating too fast now, my thoughts tumbling over one another, but I forced myself not to jump ahead of what I actually knew. I had a business card, a job title, a conversation that assumed my absence was a convenience. That was it. No grand conspiracy yet. No proof of intent. Just a shape beginning to form where uncertainty had been. That evening after they'd left again, I searched my phone. Buried in the call log was a number I didn't recognize, dialed late the night before while I'd been half conscious. It matched the number on the card. I didn't call it back, not yet. I slipped the card into my wallet behind my driver's license and closed it carefully. Whatever Whitney and Grant were planning, it involved more than family dynamics and hurt feelings. It involved paperwork. And I had the uncomfortable sense that I was already being written out of my own life. Thursday morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself was trying not to draw attention to what was happening inside it. Whitney had already left by the time I woke up. Her coffee mug sat rinsed and upside down in the sink, the legal pad gone from the counter. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the refrigerator hum, letting the stillness settle. I kept thinking about the business card in my wallet. Caleb Rourke, mobile document witness and notary services. The word witness mattered more to me than notary. It implied observation, presence, a record that didn't rely on memory or family loyalty. I didn't call him right away. Instead, I drove myself to an urgent care clinic on the edge of town, the kind attached to a pharmacy and a strip of quiet offices. I told the nurse I'd been ill for days, that I'd lost muscle control after drinking something I didn't prepare myself. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't dramatize it. I described symptoms the way I learned to describe problems at work, clearly, minimally, without emotion. They took blood. They took notes. A physician's assistant asked careful questions and wrote down my answers without comment. When she said they'd document everything and call if the lab work showed anything unusual, I felt a small, unexpected sense of relief. Documented. On the drive back, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat there, phone in my hand, the rain starting again in light scattered drops. I called the number on the card. Caleb answered on the third ring. His voice was the same as I remembered, measured, professional, but this time there was a hesitation when I said my name. "I was hoping you'd call," he said. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't pretend not to know why I was calling. That alone told me something. "I need to understand what you were asked to do," I said. "Not what you think it meant. Just what you were asked." There was a pause. Then he spoke carefully, like someone choosing words that could be repeated later. "I was contacted to verify a temporary incapacity," he said. "I was told the person involved was unresponsive due to illness and needed documentation for business continuity. When I arrived, it didn't match what I'd been told. Because I was awake, I said. Yes, he replied. And because consent matters. He told me he hadn't signed anything, that he'd left without completing the job, that he'd sent an invoice anyway, marking it incomplete. He offered to forward the email chain that had set up the appointment along with the invoice and his notes. I don't want trouble," he added. But I don't want my name attached to something improper either. I understand, I said, and I did. Back at the house, I moved slowly, deliberately. I took photos of the guest room the way it had been left. The glass in the kitchen sink, the open cabinet where Whitney kept supplements and sleep aids. I didn't touch anything, I just recorded what was already there. That afternoon, Whitney texted to say she'd be late again. I replied with a single word, okay. By evening, the email from Caleb came through, time-stamped, detailed, unemotional. Exactly what I needed, though I didn't yet know what I would do with it. I printed it and slid the pages into a folder I found in a desk drawer, one I'd used years ago for school papers. I labeled it nothing. I didn't want to give it a name yet. As the light faded outside, I realized something important. I still hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't accused Whitney or Grant of anything. But the space around me was shrinking. Whatever they were moving toward, I was now standing inside its outline. And for the first time since I'd gotten sick, I understood that staying quiet wasn't the same as staying safe. Friday morning came with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the streets clean and reflective as I drove downtown. I parked across from the bank my mother had used for as long as I could remember, the one with the blue awning and the brass handle she insisted made it feel solid. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel, telling myself I was only there to gather information. Nothing more. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled, the practiced kind that didn't assume familiarity. "I'm here about my mother's estate," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Donna Hanley." She nodded and asked for identification. When she returned with a man from the records office, he introduced himself as Mark and gestured for me to follow him to a small conference room. I recognized his face from years earlier, from afternoons when my mother had stopped by to deposit cash from the bakery and insisted I come with her. "We keep copies of finalized wills on file," he said as he opened a drawer. "I can't offer legal advice, but I can provide the documents." He laid the folder on the table between us. The will was exactly as I remembered. It measured practical, unmistakably my mother. She'd split the bakery evenly between Whitney and me. No favoritism, no assumptions, just a simple insistence that the two of us decide things together. Then I turned the page. An attached provision dated 2 years before her death spelled it out plainly. Any sale of the business, any transfer of controlling interest required the consent of both daughters. In writing, with signatures. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't about trust or grief or who had stayed closer to home. This was about removing an obstacle. Whitney hadn't needed my agreement. She'd needed my absence. Mark cleared his throat gently. "Would you like a certified copy?" "Yes," I said. "Please." While he stepped out, I stared at the document, reading it again, slower this time. The language was careful, protective. It was my mother's way of making sure neither of us could erase the other. When Mark returned, he set the copy in front of me. "If there's anything else you need." That's all I said, though. It wasn't true. Back in my car, I sat with the engine running, the will folded neatly in my bag. I thought about the tea, the business card, the word documented. I thought about Grant's voice talking about deadlines and interference. The truth settled into place with a weight that made it hard to breathe. If I stayed quiet, this would go through. The sale would happen, the bakery would be gone, and my role in it would be rewritten as someone who hadn't been capable of objecting. That afternoon, I returned to the house and went straight to the guest room. I pulled the folder from the desk drawer, the one with Caleb's emails and the urgent care paperwork, and added the certified copy of the will on top. I didn't call Whitney. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask Grant anything. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and made a decision that felt smaller than it was. I would stop protecting the idea of peace, not by shouting, not by accusing, but by refusing to disappear quietly. As the sun dropped behind the trees, I understood something that couldn't be undone. Silence had been a choice, and I was done making it. Monday morning felt heavier than the days before it, as if the weekend had pressed down on everything and left its weight behind. I drove to a small law office just off Patton Avenue, the kind tucked into a converted house with a narrow parking lot and a brass plaque by the door. The name read, Tessa McBride, Attorney at Law. Business disputes, estates. I'd chosen her because she didn't advertise urgency or drama. Her website talked about process, boundaries, documentation. That mattered to me. Inside the waiting room was quiet. No television, no stack of glossy magazines promising easy answers. When Tessa stepped out to greet me, she looked exactly like I hoped she would. Mid-40s, steady posture eyes that missed nothing and rushed nowhere. She didn't interrupt as I spoke. I laid everything out in order the night I couldn't move the notary. The emails, the urgent care visit, the will. I slid the folder across the desk when I was done. She opened it and read without comment, her pen moving occasionally in the margin of a yellow pad. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm. You understand that once we act, there's no quiet way back from this. I do, I said. And for the first time, I knew it was true. She explained my options without pressure, a temporary injunction to halt any sale or transfer, a formal complaint regarding the administration of a substance without consent if the lab results supported it, notices that would be served, records, requested timelines that would not move at anyone's convenience. This will feel slow, she said, and it will feel personal. They'll likely say you're overreacting. I thought of the word Whitney had used. Trusts me. Then we file, I said. Tessa nodded once. All right. By the time I left, the sky had cleared. It felt like a coincidence, but I took it anyway. That afternoon, Whitney called. I watched her name light up my phone and let it ring. A minute later, a text followed. We need to talk. Grant says you've been asking questions. I typed deleted and finally sent nothing. An hour later, another message arrived. You're making this harder than it needs to be. That was when I felt it, the shift. Not fear, not anger. Something firmer. The recognition that the version of peace I'd been protecting had never included me. By evening, Grant tried. His tone was polite, almost concerned. Let's slow down. There's no reason to involve outsiders. Outsiders. As if the law were a stranger in a house that belonged to him. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the folder on my desk and added the documents Tessa had prepared for me to review. I read them carefully, signing where she'd marked my name steady on the line. I wasn't confronting them, not yet. I was putting the truth where it belonged into a system that didn't care who had stayed, or who had left, who had been trusted, or who had been convenient. That night I slept with my phone on the nightstand, not under my pillow. When Whitney finally came home, I heard her moving through the kitchen, opening cabinets a little too hard. She didn't knock on my door. She didn't need to. We both knew something had changed. I lay there in the dark thinking about my mother's careful handwriting in the will, about the way she tried to protect us from ourselves. I understood now that protecting the family name had only protected the damage. Letting the truth move forward felt like a loss, but it also felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. Tuesday arrived without resolution. That was the first thing I learned about systems meant to protect you. They move on their own time, not yours. Tessa called just after 9 to tell me the filing had been accepted but not yet reviewed. No emergency hearing, no immediate order, just confirmation that the documents were in the queue. In the meantime, she said carefully, assume they may try to move faster. I thanked her and hung up the quiet afterward louder than the call itself. By mid-morning, Whitney hadn't come home. Grant's car, however, was in the driveway when I stepped outside to check the mail. That alone was enough to tighten something in my chest. Inside, the house was unusually active. Voices in the kitchen, drawers opening and closing, the low hum of a printer running somewhere down the hall. Grant was at the dining table with his laptop open and his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't look up when I entered. Yes, he was saying. We're adjusting the timeline. I'll need confirmation by end of day. He ended the call and finally met my eyes, his expression polite but strained. We're making progress, he said. You should rest. Whitney stood near the counter, arms crossed. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not overwhelmed but alert. Defensive. What's going on? I asked. Grant answered before she could. There's been some confusion, paperwork, delays. Nothing you need to worry about. The printer stopped. Whitney unplugged it and slid a stack of documents into a folder, closing it with more force than necessary. You went to a lawyer, she said. It wasn't a question, I replied. Her mouth tightened. You didn't have to do that. I said again. And this time I meant it differently. Grant stepped in smoothly. Let's not escalate this. We can sort it out privately. I looked at the folder in Whitney's hands, the careful way she held it, the urgency they'd both denied, and then confirmed without meaning to. What are you rushing? I asked. Whitney's eyes flicked to Grant. Nothing, she said. We're just trying to keep things afloat. By afternoon, the bakery called. The assistant manager, an older woman named Carol, who had worked there since before I was born, sounded unsettled. Some men came by asking questions, she said. About ownership, about whether we'd be closing. I told them I didn't know anything. My stomach dropped. That evening, I opened my email to find a notice from the bank. An inquiry. A request for clarification on authority related to business accounts. Nothing definitive, nothing stopping anything either. I forwarded it to Tessa immediately. This was the setback. Not a dramatic confrontation, not an accusation shouted across a room, just momentum moving without me. That night, Whitney knocked on my door for the first time since everything had begun. She didn't wait for an answer before stepping inside. You're going to ruin this, she said, her voice low. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand exactly what's at stake, I said. You're trying to move forward without me. She shook her head, frustrated. You weren't supposed to be involved like this. You were sick. You needed time. I thought of the tea, the notary, the careful way my absence had been planned. I'm not sick now, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing that fact for the first time. After she left, I sat on the bed and opened the folder I'd been building. Emails, records, copies. It wasn't complete. It wasn't enough yet. Waiting, I realized, wasn't passive. It was a test. They were betting I'd get tired, that I'd step back, that I'd let fear do their work for them. Instead, I made a list. People to call, questions to ask, places where the truth might already be recorded if I was willing to look. The plan had changed, and the cost of staying silent was rising by the hour. Wednesday morning began with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt since everything started unraveling. Not relief, not confidence, just focus. I met Tessa in her office just after 10. She had already reviewed the bank inquiry and the assistant manager's call from the bakery. She didn't react the way Whitney had. No alarm. No urgency disguised as reassurance. She made notes, and then leaned back in her chair. They're trying to create momentum, she said. That's not unusual. What matters is where the records lead, not how fast they move. I nodded. Feeling the truth of that settle in. We need to stop reacting to them, she continued, and start pulling information they can't control. She slid a legal pad toward me with 3 items written neatly across the top. Security footage, account authorizations, vendor correspondence. None of these require a confrontation, she said. They just require patience and access. That was the shift. I'd spent days bracing myself for arguments, for emotional appeals, for some explosive family reckoning. But the real work didn't happen in living rooms or kitchens. It happened quietly in offices and archives and digital records that didn't care who raised you. That afternoon, I drove to the bakery. Carol was behind the counter, her hair pinned up the way it always was. When she saw me, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Things have felt off." I asked her about the men who'd visited. She described them carefully. Suits that didn't fit quite right. Questions about Lisa's inventory timelines. The kind of interest that assumed decisions had already been made. "Do you still have the camera footage from last week?" I asked. She nodded. "We keep 30 days. We sat in the cramped office behind the kitchen while she pulled it up. The screen flickered, then settled. I watched Whitney enter after hours, Grant behind her carrying folders. I watched them at the desk, the file cabinet, the printer. They weren't stealing. They didn't need to. They were organizing. I thanked Carol and asked her to save copies. She didn't hesitate. That evening, I logged into the bakery's vendor portal, using credentials my mother had given me years earlier and never changed. Invoices, contracts, email chains. I found messages sent in my name that I'd never written, polite, neutral, suggesting changes that hadn't been discussed. Not forged signatures, just implied authority. By nightfall, my folder had doubled in size. Whitney didn't speak to me when she came home. Grant didn't try. The house felt brittle, like one wrong word could shatter it, so I stopped offering words altogether. Instead, I sent Tessa a summary. No opinions, no accusations, just facts. Her reply came an hour later. "This is enough to pause things. Not everything, but enough." I sat on the edge of the bed and let that sink in. The plan wasn't dramatic. It didn't promise immediate justice or public reckoning. It promised something steadier: leverage. For the first time, I wasn't chasing them. I was narrowing the space they could move in. That night, I thought about how often families mistake silence for agreement, how easily absence gets reinterpreted as consent. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was documenting reality, and whatever happened next would have to reckon with that. Thursday unfolded faster than any of us expected. By 9 in the morning, Tessa had secured a temporary order, halting any transfer of ownership or sale related to the bakery. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't justice. It was a pause, formal, enforceable, and immediate. That was all it took to change the temperature of the house. Grant didn't come home that afternoon. Whitney did, but she moved through the rooms like a stranger, checking her phone every few minutes, her confidence thinning with each unanswered call. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to me. "This can't be happening," she said aloud, as if the walls might reassure her. By noon, the bank froze the business accounts pending clarification. Vendors stopped calling Whitney and started calling Carol instead. The men in suits didn't come back. The momentum they'd relied on evaporated in real time. I stayed in my room listening, not hiding, waiting. There was nothing left to say yet. It was the call from Grant that shocked everyone. He arrived just after 3, his car pulling in too fast, his movements sharp and careless. He didn't greet Whitney. He barely looked at me. He paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, voice low but frantic. "They pulled the financing," he said. "All of it. Because of the injunction, because of the questions." He stopped pacing and turned to Whitney. "You told me she didn't matter." The silence that followed was absolute. Whitney stared at him, her face pale. "I told you she trusted me." Grant laughed, a short, hollow sound. "That's not the same thing." He finally looked at me, then really looked. Not with anger, with calculation. "You did this quietly," he said. "You didn't threaten, you didn't warn." "I documented," I replied. His jaw tightened. Within an hour, his lawyer called Tessa. Then another call followed from the investor who'd been waiting for the sale to close. Then a third requesting records, emails, authorizations, timelines. Everything Grant had rushed to secure was now being examined. Whitney sank onto the couch, hands shaking. "I was just trying to keep the business," she said. "I didn't think." "You didn't ask," I said. "You assumed." The words landed harder than I expected them to. By evening, Grant packed a bag, not in anger, in urgency. He avoided my eyes as he left, his certainty gone, replaced by something smaller and colder. The house was quiet after the door closed. What shocked everyone wasn't the injunction or the frozen accounts. It was how quickly the structure they'd built collapsed once scrutiny entered the picture. No shouting, no police, no spectacle, just consequences moving at the speed of truth. Whitney sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "I know," I replied. And I did. That didn't change anything. The stakes had peaked. The damage was undeniable, but the weight inside me hadn't lifted yet. Justice had started to move. Healing was still far away. The following Monday, the house felt like a place that had finished telling its story. Grant never came back. His lawyer handled the rest, emails, requests, formal withdrawals. The financing didn't recover. The sale collapsed quietly, the way plans do when they're built on assumptions instead of consent. By midweek, the court extended the injunction. The bakery's ownership structure was clarified in writing exactly as my mother had intended. No transfers without both signatures. No exceptions. No workarounds. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't announce itself. It settled. Whitney moved out 2 days later. She packed in silence, folding clothes with care, avoiding the rooms that held too much history. When she carried the last box to her car, she paused in the driveway. "I don't know who I am without all of this," she said. I believed her. "That's something you get to find out," I replied. "Just not here." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and drove away without asking for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. The bakery reopened the following week under a temporary management plan. Carol stayed on. The regulars returned. The ovens warmed the room the way they always had. I stood behind the counter one morning early, the sun barely up, and realized I was breathing differently, slower, deeper. I kept my job in Raleigh. I didn't move back into the house. I came to the bakery when I chose to, not because I was expected to. Boundaries, I learned, weren't walls. They were decisions. One afternoon, I sat alone in the guest room where it had all started. The bed was neatly made now, the door closed properly. I held the business card I'd nearly thrown away, crease no longer needed. Caleb's name had been useful once. It didn't define anything anymore. Healing didn't feel like relief. It felt like space. Space to think without being managed. Space to say no without apology. Space to understand that being quiet for years hadn't made me easier to love. It had made me easier to overlook. I locked the folder of documents and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not to forget. To acknowledge that the work was done. That night I slept without listening for footsteps. In the morning I unlocked the bakery door and turned on the lights. The room filled slowly, patiently, with the familiar sounds of something continuing. I wasn't erased. I wasn't replaced. I was still here. And that was enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to draw boundaries with family to protect yourself? Feel free to share in the comments, and if you'd like to follow along for more stories about justice, resilience, and healing, you're welcome to stay.